All right, hello. We're here at the Your Coach podcast. We have no intro music, no fancy logos. We're just here, just going to talking with Kyla Rollinson. Kyla is my neighbor and longtime friend and collaborating coach. Kyla is the was a personal coach at these games in Paris for Emy Legault and was on staff for Triathlon Canada at the Tokyo Games and has been a coach at multiple sort of international level events in triathlon. I don't know, I sort of missed that part, but triathlon coach.
Yes.
So we're going
Yeah.
to talk about triathlon today. So Kyla, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on your resume for our listeners.
Sure. Interestingly enough, John and I's relationship begins in athletics. However, so I started coaching masters veteran runners
Mhm.
very early on. And that was sort of one of my first forays into coaching, despite that I came from triathlon, or my final sort of adventure in sport as an athlete was in triathlon. So it started with some young junior women, notably Emily Kretz, who is a two-time Olympian, and and working with veteran runners and sort of evolved from there. So just use some of my expertise in cycling because I finished my career on the road as a cyclist, despite being a runner for quite a while, and use some of that expertise to sort of make my way into the triathlon realm as a coach, and have now been coaching triathlon as well as like the multi disciplines that come with triathlon for since about 2007, 2008. I guess that would have been about the time that we
Mhm.
had the Boreal connection, right, John? I think
Yeah.
that's about right. Um, and so that's it. Swim, bike, run. I in triathlon, you don't always get coaches that coach all disciplines. I tend to coach all disciplines.
Mhm.
And that's what I do for a living, full-time coach. So since 2014, it's been 10 years now that I left teaching and I coach full time.
Nice. So the first question that I always ask people is just sort of to go back to the beginning and talk about how you got into sport in the first place.
Yeah. I get into sport because I had too much energy in the classroom. That
Mhm.
was, me as an individual, as a person. Uh, the teacher and very one of the teachers very early on suggested to my parents that I might want to do some sport. It might
Yeah.
help me concentrate,
Yeah.
which I think is probably true of a number of different athletes.
Mhm.
But that's sort of where I started. So I got put into different odds and ends of things and ostensibly failed some swimming lessons. And the swim instructor at the time said, if you want to improve your swimming, you could always join the swim team. And that was sort of the beginning of the end. So never went back to anything recreational. Joined the swim team at 9 years of age because I failed a swim test, and the rest is sort of history. Triathlon itself was born um, not long after that. So I attended summer camp, like a lot of kids do, in Ontario, in Northern Ontario, and at a place called Accomack, which still exists. It's a multi-sport camp that brought in mostly Americans from the Eastern Seaboard, and there was a 2 week camp that was like a Swim Ontario camp at the end of like the block of 8 weeks that they used to do. So there was like a 7 week camp and a 2 week camp, and you could go for 9 weeks, but in most cases, Canadians would show up for the last 2 weeks. And I ended up there because of the swimming. And then the following summers, I think I was 11 that year. And the following summers, I stayed for the 9 weeks essentially. So 7 plus 9. And
Mhm.
that's where the idea of triathlon was introduced. So we swam open water because we did not have a pool. They basically had built, I believe it was probably one of the first ones actually
Mhm.
in the province, if not in this country, where they built a pool in the lake. So they had ends like boards, and there was a floating dock along the side, and they put cables in, They had one that was 2 lanes, 50 meter, and it went out to the dive towers, and they had one that was like 6 lane, 25 yard, because we were swimming mostly with Americans. And every morning we got up and swam a mile essentially. So we swam a mile to a dock, and people paddled and followed us. And then we got out, and you had the choice to paddle back or run back. And the run was either a K straight back through the bush, or 3K on like a trail in the bush. And so that was where the notion of like this swim bike type of thing happened. And during the summer, they had an event that was called a triathlon, which was not,
Oh.
where you swam, you paddled, and you ran.
Mm.
And that was the first time that I kind of was introduced to this multidisciplinary sort of consequential, like where it follows. And kind of like that. I like the fact that I was doing different things, and there was always an opportunity to change the outcome, if you will, because it wasn't just the one thing. Yeah.
Wow, that's super interesting that it came from that, from like summer
Mhm.
camp and everything, and
Yeah.
that's really cool. And so, and then after that, did you become kind of more like doing like races and stuff? And
Yeah, it took some time. I mean, this was early. So if I was 12, I mean, this was long
Mhm.
before triathlon was an Olympic event. And essentially what happened is my sister, who was quite a good runner, a better runner than myself, she was a 1500 3K runner, was recruited for what was essentially this kind of um triathlon program once they identified triathlon as an Olympic sport.
Mhm.
And so this would have been around, it would have been around 96. Like we would have known around 1996. And my sister got recruited by someone who's still quite well known in the triathlon community, named Barry Shepley. And he
I'm
basically,
gonna say, is
yeah,
it Barry Shepley? Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
And so he basically just went through all the lists of like swim runners in the
Mhm.
province and was like, okay, this sport is coming to the games, and we need to I'm gonna try and put together like sort of an elite squad, or a high performance development squad. And my sister was recruited for this, and she my parents didn't really want her riding alone in the countryside. So we both got bikes, and off I went and kind of ran around with my sister. It just so happens my sister was a very good swim runner, but wasn't quite as good on her bike. So it was quite complimentary. And that's sort of how the 2.0, like the real triathlon, started. And was just kind of me accompanying my sister for the sake of, because I liked this, and I liked what she was trying to do.
Mhm.
And so raced junior nationals for the first time. I think it was in 96, actually. I raced junior nationals for the first time. I was pretty useless. She was quite good. Um, and and then we kind of went from there. Yeah.
That's great. It's amazing how, like, liking it and sort of just circumstances is what
Yeah.
keeps people in the thing. And like immediately, if you have a bad experience or you don't like it, then you're just gonna not do it. But if you're liking something, it's not about like necessarily like how good you are. Like eventually it does become that, and that can help. If you're good, that's also a good reason to keep going.
Yes. Yes.
But
Yeah, yeah, and I think we see that all the time, right, John? Like in terms of development programming, you get athletes that are very talented and that are very good at certain things, but they don't necessarily like it.
Mhm.
And that is usually not favorable to people staying in that particular sort of sport
Mhm.
or line.
Mhm.
Whereas you get people all the time, and I mean, we're sort of digressing here, and we'll probably get to this a little bit later, but I believe very strongly, probably because of my background, that if somebody's very passionate about something, even if they're not very good at it, particularly when they're young, that there needs that they need to be encouraged, and they should stay, because you just never know what that's going to look like. And as coaches, we have a tendency to say, okay, well, this person may or may not succeed based on my knowledge, my experience, these testing parameters, etc. But I was, I think, an average athlete at best. But I'm coaching now,
Yeah.
and so you never know how this is gonna play out, right? And so people that are passionate, that may not be the best athletes in terms of performance outcomes, may be very could still contribute importantly to sport,
Yeah,
or community. Yeah.
definitely. And like you
Yeah.
kind of have to in a endurance sport, whether it's triathlon or just running or just one of the three, like kind of have to like it because you kind of got to do a lot of it and it's boring a lot of the time. So if you're not really liking
Yeah,
the thing, then it's, you're not going to last too long.
absolutely. Yeah. Well, and I think people have to like being in their head a lot. You like
Yeah.
endurance sport is all about kind of like in external, internal, external, internal, like, right? Oh, I'm running through the bush. This is amazing. And then it's like, oh my God, I really don't want to go up this hill. And but yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So how did you switch then into coaching from your sort of, as you put it, sort of medium athlete career?
Yeah. So, I mean, I do think you knew me as an athlete at the end of my career. And like, in all seriousness, I think I was respectable at the very, very end, but I was probably, too old, like or getting too old to really, for it to be viable at
Hmm.
that point. Um, I think that was probably, but the respectable part in terms of understanding what I was doing and maybe being just below like the highest level was probably the catalyst for me to coach. But in essence, I got into coaching by accident
Hmm.
because what happened is I ended up at training camp with Amelie Kratz and a bunch of other junior women.
Hmm.
Uh, Marianne Hogan as well. Like we had a pretty broad spectrum of people
Hmm.
that some of your listeners or viewers might know, across multiple sports, and they wanted a female coach.
Hmm.
And essentially, and this is, I didn't mention this when we talked about the camp, but at Camp Accomack, I had the only female coach I've ever had in my entire life.
Hmm.
She was an NCAA swim coach. She came from Texas. She was the daughter of one of the Division I coaches in Texas, and came with her father, um, to coach for a few weeks at this camp. And that really sort of resonated with me. Like I was struck by the fact that there was this woman who was coaching the NCAA, like, basically in the late 80s, early 90s, and that I'd never had another female coach. I'd seen a couple of female coaches on deck, when I was involved in swimming, but very few as a rule. And so when I was approached to coach these young women, because I basically let people know that it was going to be my last training camp in triathlon, and I was going to move on.
Hmm.
I was going to do some road cycling, but I was definitely done with tri. These young women, young women, actually, Alizé Brien, who won a medal at Pan Am Games last year, two medals at Pan Am Games last year in rowing. And Magali Rochette, who still races cyclocross, mountain bike, and on the road a little bit. And Amelie, they approached me to coach them because they wanted a female. I was kind of like, okay, yes, this interests me, despite the fact that I told myself that I was done and I didn't want to get out of bed at 5 in the morning ever again, kind of thing. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Ah,
yep.
cool. So yeah, that's great. I think it's good to be asked, though. I think that's a good way of, kind of getting into coaching because I think sometimes, like, I mean, for me, it was really like I was always just trying to figure out like why I wasn't better than I was, you know, and just
Yeah,
trying
there's a lot of that. Yeah.
and trying to like sort of try different things, whatever, and then it kind of, whatever snowballs. But it's nice to be asked. That's a good kind of thing. Those were great. Those three, Magali, I don't remember as well, but just Emily and Elise, like such nice, polite young women. I remember they would always say thank you after practice and stuff, and I was like, "You're welcome." Okay, cool. That's
Yeah, no, they were really well raised, and like you talk about just people loving what they do, and these girls were loved what they did. Like they love to be outside, they love to be together, they love to be on their bikes, they love to laugh. Like it was just like it was no, and they still sort of they're still connected. And it's no, they were very good young women and very successful adult women too. So
yeah. Okay, so let's talk a bit more about like training and stuff now. To start like kind of like a broad question, what do you think runners need to do to get better?
Uh, I think they need time, and I think they need to run. There's a lot of gimmicks, and we love to talk about the science, and science works, and we know that what we do needs to be evidence-based, and we need to use science to further athletes in sport. Um, but that doesn't change the fact that people need to adhere to the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are running, which improves running economy and improves basic physiological parameters, right? They need to be, as a rule, I actually think Alex Hutcherson just published an article on this in Outside
Hmm.
on just how being with a group of people is beneficial, like
Hmm.
how you need to be, yes, you need to do what you do, but the notion of trying to do everything alone is really is proving, at least in the research that they've got, to indicate that there isn't quite as much um, success if you're trying to do it alone. So I
Hmm.
think people need to run, and they need to be with a group of people. Um, and those are the two big things. So what are fundamentals? Fundamentals are, you just get the basics right. You
Hmm.
do your core, you do your strength, you get your basic running down. You respect the baseline sort of zones, or like training energy systems parameters. People get really excited about, running on the track, running fast, overrunning workouts, doing things that are fancy, but they don't get the basics right. And the basics are also getting enough sleep, eating properly, that type of thing. It's the boring stuff. It's the stuff that you call boring. The stuff that isn't sexy.
Hmm.
That's what needs to be done.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, so what do you think of the whole sort of Ingebrigtsen like double threshold business? What's your take on this? How does that fit into this, kind of
Yeah.
fundamentals?
So I think it fits. Um, but it fits in a certain population.
Hmm.
Um, I think that trying to do double threshold work on your own, either with or without your lactate machine, can be very complicated. And I think it can be more of a distraction than a benefit if it's not applied or sort of implemented appropriately. So I approve of lactate. I
Hmm.
believe that it's most beneficial in a context where we're using it for testing purposes and then implementing a certain protocol, so a training program, and then going back and testing and seeing what that looks like.
Hmm.
We all know that lactate testing as a rule has been around since the 1970s, and now it's kind of changed course because it's much more mainstream, it's much more accessible, and the Norwegians have made it sort of a staple in terms of the running. So what do I think of it? I think that it's credible and that it can be used, but I also think that it needs to be used in the right context. And we could probably do a 1 week podcast on what that context looks like. But I would encourage people, if they're interested in using it, to start with somebody who's well versed in lactate and in lactate testing, and to do something that's a controlled test in a lab, and or on the track with that person, physiologist, and then to use those parameters to build out something that then you can retest. Using it every single day per se, I think is complicated,
Hmm.
expensive, and not very viable, particularly for
Hmm.
your everyday runner.
Yeah. So in I mean, so I want to ask about not so much the threshold part, but the double part. So in
Yep.
triathlon, you've got three sports. So
Yeah.
you're doing probably two workouts most day or two activities most days. Is that something in triathlon where you're probably doing two harder sessions in a day sometimes?
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, sorry, I kind of talked around your question, but yes, 100%. So we had quite a humorous conversation actually with a couple of athletes only a few weeks ago about that, because I had someone asking about double threshold for the run,
Mhm.
and the answer, and one of the other athletes in the group said, we do double threshold at least 3 times a week. What are you talking about? And so I mean, yes, I think by nature we are double threshold athletes. Yeah.
Mhm.
And not necessarily like in a single discipline, but sometimes in a single discipline you
Mhm.
can, and swimming is the same. You know,
Mhm.
anything where you're an endurance sport and you have doubles or triples in a day,
Mhm.
there is a very strong possibility that this is part of your reality already.
Mhm.
You know, whether it's being measured or not, the way that the workouts are built would indicate that they're a double threshold. Yes.
Mhm. Um, so you've coached Olympians, and you've also coached sort of the adult rec group.
Yep.
What are some things that are actually the same about coaching those two groups, and what are some things that are maybe different?
I think the things that are the same are that no progress can be made unless the fundamentals are adhered to. And the biggest part of that is like athlete health.
Mhm.
So whether you're dealing with somebody who's 60 or whether you're dealing with somebody who's 16, um, obviously there's a risk of injury, and there is absolutely no way of developing or progressing an athlete if they are carrying injury, they're unhealthy.
Mhm.
And so injury mitigation, regardless of the athlete's age, is probably key to like what would sort of bridge that.
Mhm.
I think the other thing you actually identified it, you
Mhm.
know, um, Olympians need to love what they're doing as much as a 60-year-old needs to love what they're doing. If their husband's dragging them to the track because they want to get them back in shape and they don't want to run, then you're not going to make much progress. And at the end of the day, if you're asking a high level athlete to do something that is extremely difficult, because it is, and I think we have a tendency to not recognize how hard the
Mhm.
stuff that they're doing is, they have to fundamentally be in love with it. They have to be extremely passionate about it, because you run, I still try to run, but essentially, you know, your demons come out. Like athletes compartmentalize really, really well, regardless of their age. High level athletes do a better job of compartmentalization than others, simply because they would never get back on the track or back in the pool if they didn't.
Mhm.
But if you're not 100% sure of what you're doing when you get up there to
Mhm.
swim back up the Seine at 1.2 meters per second,
Yeah.
then you're cooked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm still running. I ran this morning,
Yeah.
and I was doing some like just loops of LeBaire Park, like the football field. So like
Yeah.
run fast up the hill.
Yeah.
And it's definitely like you're like, I really don't need to be here. Like nobody is making me be here.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why
Yeah.
am I doing this? We're like, oh, I like it.
Yes.
I like it.
Yeah. It doesn't, and I think like you talk about what's the same. Well, that's the same.
Mhm.
That's the same. Like the athlete that is, standing in front of a crowd of 60,000 people and scared to death, and they're like, what am I doing here? Is the same thought as like the 60-year-old who's there trying to run their first 5K in like 15 years, and they're like, what am I doing here? It's the same, that's the same thing. And so I think making sure that people are healthy, making sure that people are happy, and basically supporting them in that process is similar. It's similar across the whole spectrum, you know. That's yeah. I can come out and cheer for you. I can tell you what to do or tell you it's okay, or you can stop if you want.
Yeah.
That's yeah, the
Yeah.
coach.
I'm gonna run a cross country race next weekend, so we'll see how that
That's awesome. That is awesome. That is totally awesome. I'm a little jealous.
goes.
I'm actually going to Joe Beef Park to do some sprints with like a tire today.
Oh wow, with the
Just so you
tire.
know, yeah. Yeah, so I'm gonna do, yeah, just for run mechanics. So it's actually, I'm doing a little kid move. I'm doing like a development move. I've just got like a smaller tire, which is like a mountain bike tire to start, not a big one.
Okay.
like just so that I like get my hips up and then I run properly, and just so that I'm like, because I want to start doing some faster stuff, but I'm worried about my mechanics because I'm not fit. And yeah,
Yeah, well, that's good. That's good.
yeah, there you go.
Get out there. So same two groups. What's different? Like I think sometimes we see, like the workout Wednesdays and all the sort of stuff, and even like
Yeah.
the double thresholds and stuff like that. And even though there are all these similarities, like there are probably some things that are, really advanced moves and that people should probably not attempt. So what are some of those things where there's kind of like a line of like, well, if you're not really an elite level athlete, like you probably don't need to go there.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna quote somebody that I don't know, and I don't want to sort of overstep here, but I'm pretty sure that it was Richard Lee. So when I did that performance athletics course with Felix like years ago, where we did it was sort of like they were doing a test kind of course for athletics,
Yeah.
and Richard Lee of like BC Endurance was there, and we had lots of conversations about different things, and he said, you know, one of the things people do is they think that it's important to do workout Wednesdays. But if you're not doing a minimum amount of running economy is poor, which I just referenced because mine is, right?
Yeah.
Injury risk is very high. So the benefit of like doing actual intervals
Mm-hmm.
is somewhat negligible,
Mm-hmm.
and that's not sexy. Like people
Mm-hmm.
don't want to not go to the track. And
Yeah.
for a fact that when we worked with the veterans, they love coming to the track because they get to run fast, they're with their friends and
Yeah.
teammates. But if you're talking about actual outcomes, like running outcomes,
Yeah.
that is probably to the detriment as opposed to the benefit of the runner, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
I believe people should do intervals, but I think there's a minimum amount of running that needs to be done before you start hitting the track.
Mm-hmm.
And
Do
that'll
you
allow.
have a number on that? I'm curious.
Yeah, so
Okay.
I actually I think that unless people are running between 30 and 40K a week, they should not be like doing speed work. Yeah.
Okay. That that tracks. So I did a very unscientific study once with my group. So again, kind of hard, but whatever. Looking at like, how much they ran and
Yep.
how much quality they did and stuff like that. And the number that jumped out to me was people were improving up to 300 minutes of running without really doing any intervals. And once
Correct.
you get beyond that, then if you want to kind of improve again, then you kind of need to layer on those intervals. But 300 minutes
Yeah.
is kind of, and I did this myself in my recent training because I sort of was starting from zero because I
Yep.
blew up my knee. And it was hard because, yeah, like you want to do the fun stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's like, no, you can't do the fun
Yeah.
stuff yet. You have to wait.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I think that's a good hard bit of advice because especially for like that Boreal group, like that's the social component is so
That's
important.
correct. Yeah.
And that's where they do that. I mean, they also have the long run on Saturday, which they can do
Yes.
socially is easy, but
Yeah.
it's a challenge to find ways to, keep people engaged. And
Yeah.
like, there's it's hard because we said like you want to love it, but it's still hard. Even if you love it, it's still hard to just
Oh,
do
so
easy
hard.
running only every day.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's so hard because in most cases you're running mileage alone. In
yeah,
the winter, we're often running it indoors or in the dark with
yeah,
the ice or the snow, which is really hard. Whereas like
yeah.
the intervals are indoors, it's warm, you're with people.
Mhm.
The other thing about like the intervals, which I think as a coach, I also struggle with too, because I want people to come to the track. I love the ambience of having people at the track. And not only that, when you have quite a diverse group of runners,
Mhm.
and in this case, like if I would reference, let's say the existing group that I have like Amy, who runs as fast as the men, essentially, or just below my fastest men. I can put them all on the track with either younger athletes or slower athletes and have people run partial distances, partial workouts, still run the workout, and they can all be together and we can still have a quality session without too much sort of interference or issues. And so that's one of the benefits of doing intervals is that too, right? Is that you can kind of manage a much more diverse group of people in a sort of safe space, or like a, you know,
Mhm.
in the same space. And so it's really hard to say to people, well, sorry, don't show up until you've hit 35, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or at the very beginning of Concordia, we always had this where we would go for group runs and that would be the thing.
Yeah.
But someone would show up and they would be really like lagging behind.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
they would just not come back. But it's like
Right.
if we had gone to the track, like they definitely
That's
should
right.
be doing intervals, but at least
Yeah.
they would be with the group and then they might
That's
come
right.
back.
Yeah. Absolutely. Like it's so much more inclusive on the track. And so I totally understand why we default to that, you know?
Mhm.
But yeah. Yeah.
Mhm. Okay. So on the triathlon front, you said before runners need to run to get better,
Yeah.
but there clearly there's some benefits to what we would call cross training and you would just call training um in swimming and biking. So for runners, how how can they use those, I don't know what you call them, like sports, different sports, or different training module, what's the word I'm looking for,
Like
modules,
modalities or
modalities, there we go. I don't know if it's a modality, but whatever. Just like, how can a runner use swimming and biking to get better at running?
yeah. So I'm assuming that you've given your runners like water running before. There's all sorts of ways you can use water running. And I think that for people who are more injury prone than others, and there are people like that, regardless of how much running people do or how fit they are, there are people that are just more, you know, more resilient than others.
Hmm.
So the water piece is really interesting because I think that, I mean, swimming per se, unless you know how to swim, is a very difficult ask because it's a
Hmm.
massive technical sort of um,
Hmm.
there's a massive technical demand, which means that unless you know how to swim, the benefits from swim training are going to be fairly limited.
Yeah.
Putting people in the water, either with a belt or without, and having them water run, either on the bottom in a shallower pool or in a deeper pool,
Mhm.
and can be extremely beneficial. I've actually seen, like in the US, when we go to training camp, we'll often see the sprinters in the pool, like after they've been on the track,
That's
and
cool.
some of that is just like distending like a lot of like the muscle tension that you get from really like the really sharp punchy stuff on the track, like it loosens things off. It also it tends to be pretty good just for anything that's sinewy, so like Achilles tendon or like, you know, fascia, all of that stuff. The water does a really good, as long as you're not like pushing off the wall, like there's not a lot of plyo stuff, diving, etc. The water's really good. And there's this kind of idea that kicking is bad for runners, but kicking, because of like the hip angle and sort of the way that you use like the range of like the foot and stuff like that, actually distends, you know, the calf, and can really help like the hip flexor. And so I do think there are some pretty massive benefits in the pool.
Mhm.
The water running also, and this is contrary to the actual release portion or the relaxed portion, but the water running, if you want to use it for intervals, which you can,
Mhm.
um, I find really helps people's glutes. So if they're doing it properly, and I've even put like shoes on people in the water, right? To simulate, like, so they can wear a belt and wear running shoes in the water so that they
Mhm.
have the weight on the foot the same as they would be if they were like actually weight bearing.
Interesting.
So there are all sorts of things you can do in the water, that I think are beneficial for running.
Mm.
Riding, same thing. So if you're dealing with somebody who's having trouble getting their mileage up, either due to mechanics or they're coming or it's a return to run, the running is really beneficial from just like a motor standpoint, like an aerobic conditioning standpoint, without the weight bearing. And you
Mhm.
could do things on a bike if people are comfortable and they have a good bike. You can even do some pretty decent training, like in terms of climbing, like hill climbing and
Mm.
things like that. People that have Achilles tendon stuff, the actual riding simulates a heel drop, right? So when we like do rehab for Achilles tendon and people do heel drops,
Yeah.
it's very similar to the movement that you get when you're climbing on a bike, either standing or seated. And so that can be really beneficial too. So there's all sorts of stuff. Yeah.
That's really interesting. I was thinking about this on my run this morning, and I was thinking about just sort of different injuries and things, and like, I mean, do cyclists get injured? I feel like you can crash and stuff, but like what are some injuries that a cyclist would get? Because you think as a runner, like, okay, if I'm injured, I can usually hop on the bike, so that's good. What might be some injuries that a cyclist would get?
Knees and hips,
Okay.
so repetitive injury strain, like it could be, well, cycling injuries are very often related to um, a poor bike fit.
Yeah.
But cyclists will get like patellofemoral syndrome, really tight
Mhm.
quads, not using glutes and hamstrings enough. They'll get medial lateral ligaments. ITB is something that happens if the seat height is too high. There's too much climbing. If cleats are not put on properly, we
Mm.
can get you can get like a pinched fat pad or meniscus stuff,
Mm.
and people will sometimes actually get because they're really really tight, so like the femur will push back up into the SI joint, they get like a sore hip or sore lower back. You'll often get that type of thing.
Oh, okay.
um, it's not quite as common, but cyclists will sometimes, same as rowers, will sometimes get like stress fractures in ribs
Mm.
just from like the climbing, the breathing, like that stuff. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, so to go back to the water running, yeah, when I was in university, our coach, who was actually Brent McFarlane, who was like the Olympic coach in 1996.
Yeah.
So when I started university, it was 1996. So like he had come off the Olympics, and then like he was coaching us, and
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't have a clue at the time, but
Most of the time nobody does. That's the
no,
thing. And then afterwards they're like, I think I had a really good coach.
yeah,
You know?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So Brent had us in the pool, had everybody in the pool twice a week, no matter what.
Yeah.
Like that was just part of it. You just do
Yeah.
pool and twice a week.
Yeah.
And it was so I learned it. So it's sort of, I mean, not the same as swimming because I'm like a terrible swimmer and I cannot benefit from swim training at all. But the pool running I can do, and like what, so in my rehab as well with the knee, like
Yeah.
I was in the pool across the street a lot because
Yeah.
I could do that, and I could do, I could do harder stuff a little bit just for more to, keep my mind off whatever, like just to do
Yeah.
something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a great tool. You just need to have, a pool that you can go to. But
That's right. Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
do
If
you
you
have
have
a
a belt, you can go at the beach too. Like
Hmm.
I've put athletes like in open water, and actually sometimes like in the summer in Montreal anyway, with all the outdoor pools,
Hmm.
man, if you're doing rehab, you put a belt on or you go to the outdoor pool, that's awesome. You're like,
Mhm.
I'm loving my life.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know, like running
Be
outside.
outside. Yeah,
Yeah.
be outside.
Hmm.
For what was I gonna ask about cycling? Oh yeah, is there a kind of like a comparative, like kind of a ratio or something? Like in my mind, I've always felt like it's sort of 2 to 1. Like if you go for like a 3 hour bike, that's kind of like an hour and a half run. I'm not sure. Is that accurate to you, or is there something else, or is there not really a ratio?
Yeah, I would say it's probably more like um I don't know if it's quite 2 to 1. I think it also depends on like how hard you're riding, et cetera, what you're doing. Like if you're doing base, then yeah, maybe you need 2.5 hours for like 90 minutes.
Hmm.
Um, but generally speaking, I would say it's more to do with like the intensity of of the effort rather than the duration. So like 90 minutes of running is probably equivalent to 90 minutes of riding if you're doing repeats on Canadian Emy. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because like it's a heart rate based sort of,
Hmm.
there's like a training density there that, you know, um, but yeah, it's really different. And again, it's different inside. So like,
Hmm.
riding inside as a rule, I always like tick down.
Okay.
So if you're, yeah, so if like I'm not a huge fan, and I think some of that is actually very personal, just because I would go bonkers riding inside if it was like three
Yeah.
hours. But some people are really happy doing it.
Sure.
But I tend to keep it on the lower side. So like I would do less riding inside relative to the amount of running versus outdoor riding type of thing. Yeah.
Hmm.
But I'm not gonna lie and say I have some kind of a scientific formula. Like I essentially like if you ask me, okay, I was going to do 90 minutes of running, but I can't, so I'm going to go for a bike ride. How long should I ride? I wouldn't give you more than 2.5 hours.
Okay, makes sense. Um, so when you're coaching the three sports and in tandem and linking them all together, do you train sort of like all of the energy systems in all of the sports, or do you kind of have a like swimming is more, like faster stuff and bike is start like how do you, manage that? Or
Yeah.
is it just individual?
It's a good question. I mean, I think like when I first started coaching, I did a heck of a lot more block training than I do now.
Hmm.
Um, I will block train with athletes that have a really serious gap in a specific area when we're on a timeline relative to an event.
Hmm.
But otherwise, I tend to do everything all at once, and it doesn't change a ton, um, year over year. The only thing I would say is that in a 4 year, in a quad, I always do 1 year of reverse periodization.
Okay.
So I'll look at like what I've done. I usually do 3 and 1, but I do 1 year of reverse where like instead of just starting with like base training in the fall, I'm like, okay, we're gonna do shorter stuff this fall, and then we're gonna build from like Jan and mid-Jan, end of January. Um, and I find that just works well for people because in many cases triathletes are running cross country, so it gives them just a little bit of like a touch more edge like in the fall, and then we can start back at sort of the foundation in the winter.
Oh, sorry. When you said block training, just to make sure people
Yeah.
understand what that means. So that would mean that you'd be, say, working threshold in swim, bike, and run, and just only that in a block, like the same type of training in a block, if that's what you want to work on
Yeah,
across the board.
or I would block, or more to like probably what I actually mean more is I block swimming, and I would be like,
Oh, okay.
we're
Only
doing a
swimming.
speed block in swimming.
Okay.
Only swimming. We're not doing any speed on the run. You're doing found like just
Just
like base
okay.
running base running. And
Mm,
we're just gonna do, we're doing 5 weeks of like front end speed, you
okay.
know. So that would be like block training for me. And like I said, as a rule, I try to overlay
Mm,
everything. So I don't adhere to the principle of block training like as a rule, simply because I feel like in a multidisciplinary sport,
mm,
you need to lean on your strengths as much as you work on your weaknesses. So if I start taking out that the cycling because you're a good cyclist
mm,
to try and work on your swimming, I've just compromised the one thing that you can lean on.
mhm. Yeah.
So like it's a bit of a dance. And
Mhm.
some people you can take, like I'm working with a young woman right now who is really, really strong on her bike. And I've just made the decision that we're just gonna offload her bike entirely, and I'm gonna take the chance because she really needs to improve her swim.
Mhm.
Right. But in most cases I don't do that. Yeah.
See, yeah, that's interesting. Like, I think so. I've had conversations with two different people recently, kind of on this. And one, do you know Alfredo?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was talking to Alfredo, and Alfredo says he never works on weaknesses because he says he wants to take what the athlete is strong at and
Yeah.
focus on it. Now he's a coach of a multi-events coach, so
Yes.
similar kind of thing
Yep.
where
Yeah.
you're like, okay, instead of like I don't know, say you're like your pole vault is not good, like instead of spending all this time on pole
That's
vault
right.
just to be
Yeah.
able to get like a little bit more, like
Yep.
work on what's strong. So is that
Yeah.
something that you would kind of do as well?
I would say like as a rule, yes, that's my theory as well. The problem here is the challenge in triathlon is that if you don't have a great swim, then you're often out of the race to
Hmm.
begin, like, and so you and this gets me into a more technical conversation about triathlon, but essentially triathlon is quite a young sport, and it's extremely dynamic, it's fluid. And so currently in the men's field, even if you're not a great swimmer,
Mhm.
there's a large possibility that the race is going to come back together as it did at the games,
Mhm.
and that if you are a runner, that you are still going to be very much in that race. In the women's field, like currently, that is not the case. If you are not swimming, you are in a chase pack, and the likelihood of you running for a medal or a podium at the highest level
Mm.
is very slim.
Mm.
But several years ago, that was the case. So in 2016, that was the case for the men. Okay. So there's this constant flux in terms of the way the races play. The women tend to be a full quad behind the men in terms of race dynamics. And so in all likelihood, we're going to see a race in LA where it will be similar to the men's race in Paris, and the race will come together, and women who are potentially not competitive at the front of the race right now will be in LA because most of them can run relatively well, or they wouldn't be racing at that level to begin with. Yeah.
Interesting. So is it like a tactics thing on the women's part? Because I remember, thinking like the guys, like the kind of like the bike kind of went out and then they caught them, and then it's just like, I'm like, why did they let them catch them? Like, but on the women's side, there's like, it's more spread out and it just stays that way.
That's right. Yeah.
Why?
So I think like the women's field is still is not quite as deep as the men's field, and the gaps are like much larger, so the race is a little bit more dilute than the men's race. But at the same time, like I said, 8 years ago, so 2 quads ago, that's exactly what the men's race looked like. You had probably 6 to 8 guys that were capable of making a front group, and the race never came back. And that was like the Brownlee strategy, right? They're just like full gas in the water, they'd get out and then they'd go for it, and whoever stayed on was in. And whoever didn't, well, see you later. That's your problem. And that's kind of the way the women are racing right now. Like there was a period of time where the women, I would say, kind of all just looked at each other on the bike, right? Like that's what it was. And now we've gotten to a point where the women are quite good on their bikes. And you need to be a skilled rider, and you need to be able to pilot and navigate the cycling portion of the race if you want to be competitive. And so the race isn't coming back together yet, but I think it will.
That's really cool. Thank you for sharing that like deep insight into triathlon. I think that people don't really get that. I don't think, you kind of watch and like, oh, okay, they're racing, but understanding, why things are moving that way. It's really interesting. So those are the questions I have for you. I like to keep these things, short to like 40 minutes or so people actually watch the whole thing. So thank you. Thank you very much. We're not like Joe Rogan here and go off and, for hours and hours.
People just turn that on and then they listen to it while they're like washing dishes or something. Is that what happens?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know. Okay. I'm not a big listener of like super long podcasts. I'm
about 40 minutes, like 30 to 40 minutes. And then
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well,
thanks, John.
You so much. And I might swing by Joe Beef later to see if there's something to see there.
Yeah. I'll drop a pin for you. Here I am.
If you want somebody to like yell at you or whatever.
I do not want somebody to yell at me. I'm really okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, John. Good. I appreciate that. Have a great day.
All right. Thank you.